This all started, I have to say, with a hip operation. I had hip replacement. How many of you have had hip replacement surgery? Okay. How many of you will have hip replacement surgery? Everybody. It was in May of the year 2000, and I had something called a slipped epiphysis when I was 14 years old. That's something that happens to overweight boys in their early adolescence. And mine was, yes, the only person who didn't think I was overweight was my dear mother, who's now departed. And if she would come back miraculously, she would say, no, he was not overweight, he was pleasingly plump. Well, I was pleasingly plump and I was overweight. And I couldn't wait to outgrow husky sizes. I don't know if anybody remembers husky sizes, but God, I hope they don't torture pleasingly plump adolescent boys and girls with the husky label anymore, but they did me. And so I had a slipped epiphysis, which was misdiagnosed. And I've written about this elsewhere, and it was a very painful experience, and I don't really want to go into it. But it meant that in 1989, I had a hip replacement. After having a couple surgeries when I was 14 and 15, I had a hip replacement here at the Hospital for Special Surgery. Then, in the year 2000, that hip replacement, my being an active person, had worn out, so I had another hip replacement. And this I had done at New England Baptist Hospital with a very great surgeon. So I had this done in May of the year 2000. And, it was a difficult surgery because it was a replacement of a replacement. And it was a long, tedious recuperation, but, I threw myself into it. And by the end of the summer, I was still walking on crutches, but everyone said I was fine. And in August of the year 2000, our younger daughter, Elizabeth, whom we call Liza, was heading off to college. And I really wanted to be there. I mean, it was my baby. We have two daughters. One's a senior now at Wesleyan, and Liza's a junior. And this would be my first trip since my surgery. And so it was on August 19th. So I boarded a plane with my wife and went down to Atlanta, where Liza was enrolling in that well-known, historically black women's university, the best women's university in the world. It's called Spellperson College. I used to tell Johnetta that joke all the time, and she called me. She said, if you don't stop calling it Spellperson, I'm going to kill you. So anyway, we enrolled Liza. It was very teary. Sharon and I said goodbye to her that Saturday, and she was very embarrassed by us, and she wanted us to go away. We'd planned to stay for the whole weekend. So off we went. Now, Sharon, my wife, collects shells. So she went off to Sanibel Island to collect shells, and I was still on crutches. So I jumped on the plane and flew back to Boston. And that Sunday, I went down to P-Town, down to Provincetown, and had brunch with some friends, took the fast boat down, and I was doing okay, still on my crutches. And that night, I came back, I went out. I'm an Indian food junkie. Yeah, I love Indian food. I went to graduate school in England, where Indian food in 1973 was like Chinese food when I left New Haven. My friends say I have two lips. One's Madras and one's Vindaloo. So whenever I'm by myself, I go out and I have Indian food. So I had Indian food at a restaurant in Brookline with a friend. And then I came back. I live right on campus on a place called Francis Avenue, right down the street from the Divinity School. And I pulled into my driveway. I was driving myself and got my little crutches out. And the last thing I remember, I always listen to NPR, and the last thing I remember was that the announcer, the DJ as it were, said that it was going to be unseasonably cold. Now remember, this is August 21st by now. And I couldn't figure out what that meant. So I went upstairs. We have a 3-story house, and I went upstairs to the 3rd floor to our bedroom, and I went to sleep. So I woke up, I was freezing. And so I put on a pair of sweats, and I went back to sleep, and I woke up again. I was colder still, and I put on a sweater. And I was cold, woke up again, and I put on a pair of socks. And I woke up again, I was colder still, and I went to our winter closet and got a down comforter. And I put on the down comforter, I went back to sleep. I woke up again, I was colder still, and quick mind that I am, I went over and turned the air conditioner off. So much for the Harvard professor, blah, 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 blah. Not only did I turn the air conditioner off, I turned the heat on because I was so cold. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I woke up again, and I was writhing in pain. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was in this big old house by myself. So I made my way down to the kitchen, made some coffee. By this time, the Times and the Globe and the Wall Street Journal were there, so I got them as my morning ritual. And I took a couple aspirin, but I wasn't getting any better, so I made my way up these 3 stories back to the bedroom, and I went back to sleep. And by 7 o'clock, I knew that something was seriously wrong. So I called my wife down to Sanibel and woke her up, and I told her something was wrong, and she said, call your trainer. I'd had a physical therapist to get me through this. And I called the physical therapist. My secretary, Joanne, gets in at 8 o'clock, and I just live a couple blocks from my office. So about 8:30, both of them came over, and they carried me from the 3rd floor down to the driveway and rushed me to New England Baptist. It was also emotional. It didn't occur to us that we could call 911 and that they would do this for us. So I went over to the hospital, and they ran tests on me all day long. And eventually, they stuck this big needle in my hip. I was in so much pain, I couldn't even feel it. And I heard the doctor who was extracting the fluid from my hip say, uh-oh. And so I knew it was bad. And about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my doctor came in, and he had that look on his face. And he said, I have bad news and I have good news. And I said, well, give me the good news. And he said, well, the good news is that your hip is infected. And I said, I knew I was in a lot of pain. But I said, damn, that's the good news? What's the bad news? He said, you have a raging infection, and we're not sure we can cure the infection. And I said, well, what's that mean? He said, if we can't cure the infection, we will never be able to give you a hip again. You'll spend the rest of your life without a hip. My white cell count was 300,000. Your white cell count, ma'am, is about 10 right now. So they thought, and in fact, I'd just come back from Africa where I'd made a film series, and the doctor said, we think that your infection is so severe that we think it's something malarial-based. In fact, we think it's something you brought back from Africa. People are hard on Africa. When they can't figure out where anything comes from, it comes from Africa. Well, it turns out that that raging infection that I had, which was quite severe, which I brought back from Africa, really was a strep infection, which I got in the operating room at darkest New England Baptist Hospital the previous May. So I asked him, what did that mean? When were they going to take my hip out? Tomorrow? Next week? He said, tomorrow we're going to take your hip out in 15 minutes. But they couldn't find the right blood, and so anyway, they took it out the next morning. Now, why am I telling you more about my medical condition than you ever wanted to know? Well, I spent 3 months, 6 weeks of which were spent with a little thing poking out of my chest, and I was hooked up to a computer and antibiotics 3 times a day, and eventually they cured the infection, and then in November, they gave me a new hip, okay? Well, the reason I'm telling you all this is that without that episode, I never would have found the Bondwoman's narrative. I was so bored. I am a very active person, and I couldn't do anything but physical therapy. So I went through Judge Judy. I almost got a law degree. I watched so many. Judge Joe Brown, Judge this, Judge that. I tried Jerry Springer one day, but there were too many people from West Virginia on there, so and that's where I'm from. For anybody in West Virginia, I am a loyal West Virginian. I'm not trashing our people, but too many people sleeping with each other and who had the same last names. I couldn't I couldn't handle Jerry Springer. Then came the general election, and boy, that election was great. I was so glad. Now, I'm a loyal Democrat. I like Al Gore. You know, I voted for Al Gore. I have to say that, full disclosure. But I was glad that there was, there were hung chads in Florida. Why? Because it gave me something to watch on TV. I would come downstairs on my crutches, and I would make my little coffee at 8:30, and I'd get my papers, and then I would sit in front of the TV, and we have this little digital clock on the top of the TV, and when it turned to 9 o'clock, I'd click it, and there would be CNN, and I would count the Chad right with him. I wanted to volunteer to be a Chad counter. And I was so angry at the Supreme Court, not only because it yielded a result that I did not particularly like, but they took away my daily entertainment by calling an end to the Chad count. Well, after that, I became bored again. There was nothing to watch on TV during the day. Now, I, like many people in this room, am on every collector, every antiquarian's mailing list for every seller of Africana or Afro-Americana. And I keep these all in a little bookshelf, shall I say, in my favorite reading room. So one day while I was sitting in my favorite reading room, I happened to pick up the Swan Gallery auction catalog. Now, the Swan Gallery, based here in the city, has an annual Black History Month auction of Afro-Americana. In fact, they just had their auction last week. And you know, Black History Month, it's February, right? Everybody knows that. The coldest, darkest, shortest month. That's the month they gave to us. It's awful. You know, how come we couldn't have April, you know, or July or something like that? So anyway, I was sitting there, and there it was, lot number 30. And lot number 30 said a 301-page handwritten manuscript, purportedly written by a female fugitive slave who had escaped, who had lived in Virginia, then Washington, and then escaped from North Carolina. Now, when I saw this, I almost slipped off my favorite reading room place. Now, why? The reason is holograph manuscript. Holograph means handwritten manuscript. Handwritten manuscripts are exceedingly rare for any writers in the 19th century. Why is that the case? It's the case because a printer would buy your manuscript. Not just the right to publish your manuscript, they would buy your manuscript. And what need had they for your manuscript once the book was printed? So once your book was printed, they would toss your manuscript into the trash, and very few writers were clever enough, prescient enough, to collect their manuscript and preserve it so we could see their revisions. So holograph manuscripts are exceedingly rare. For African American writers, or even white writers writing about the African American experience, they're non-existent at that time. We have letters from Frederick Douglass, but we do not have Frederick Douglass's manuscripts. We have some letters, I think, of William Wells Brown, but we don't have any of his manuscripts. So it meant that there was a good chance that this would be the first holograph manuscript of a black writer. At least it was worth pursuing. So I thought about it. I talked to my family about it. You know what an auction catalog looks like. It's got a floor, and it has an imagined ceiling. And the floor was $8,500, and the ceiling was thought to be about $10,000, which is a lot of money to pay for a book. But I thought that there were so many avid collectors that this thing would go for maybe $100,000. And I really wanted it. I read the description, and the description said that it was from the collection, of Dorothy Porter Wesley. It was the most famous bibliophile and librarian of the 20th century after Arthur Schomburg. And you all know Arthur Schomburg because the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library is the Schomburg Library, named after Arthur Schomburg, who was from Puerto Rico and was a great collector. But Dorothy Porter Wesley, upon whom Radcliffe conferred an honorary doctorate degree in 1988, she was the brilliant librarian who oversaw and really brought to perfection, as close to perfection as a collection can get, of Afro-Americana, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University. And she was a good friend of mine. In fact, every year at the Du Bois Institute, we give a pre-doctoral fellowship named after Dorothy Porter Wesley, which she funded herself. And this was from her collection. And the catalog description said, it is not clear that this is the work of a Negro, quote unquote, as it said, which meant that someone thought that it was written by a black person, by a Negro. But it said that the route of escape described in the novel was one often used by fugitive slaves. Now, I was still on crutches. I couldn't go down to the preview at the Swan Gallery auction house. So I just had to do it on faith. So I discussed the limit with my family, and then because I couldn't travel, I asked our director of research, Richard Newman, if he would go in my stead. Now this turned out to be a gift from God, really. Why? Because Richard Newman happens to be a white American. If I had shown up and started bidding on that manuscript, some of my rival collectors would have looked at me and said, I don't know what that little Negro knows. But there is something here. So I dispatched Dick. I wasn't smart enough to give him a cell phone so he could call me, but I dispatched Dick, and I waited right in my living room for this auction to begin. Now, it was lot number 30. The auction begins at 10:30. It was February 15th, 2001. I figured it would take about an hour to get to lot number 30, so, you know, it would start a little late. By noon, I should hear. But noon came and went, no phone call. So I figured that, given my vulnerable state, Dick didn't want to hurt my feelings. And so I figured that I'd lost it. And then I was angry at myself because we had discussed an upper limit. And I figured, why didn't I go for it? You know, so what if I'd have to take a second mortgage? You know, why didn't I go for it? And I thought maybe there's some great collectors. Ken Chenault, the CEO of Amex, great collector. Bill Gates collects all kind of things. The Gilded Lehrman, they collect. Often I find myself bidding against them. But so I figured that you know, one of them had gotten it, or Charles Blockson down in Philadelphia or something like that. So I was very angry. So I went through a period all day long of different phases of grief. First I was deeply sad, then I was very angry at myself, and finally resignation. At about 9:30, I went to bed. And Dick hadn't called, so I just sort of gave up. And I was really sad about that because I just had a hunch about this manuscript. 10:30, the phone rang. It was Dick. And he woke me up, and I said, so Dick, who got it? Who got it? He said, what do you mean? I said, who got the manuscript? He said, you got the manuscript. I said, how much did I got the manuscript for? Oh, my God, he did bid $100,000. Because I really thought it was going to go for $100,000. I mean, you can't. One letter at that auction from Frederick Douglass went for $34,000. One poem called Ocean from Phyllis Wheatley sold for $70,000 at another auction, I believe, that same year. So I figured, you know, $100,000. He said, you got it for $8,500. I was the only bidder. The only bidder. You see, the advantage of having Dick go as a white American was that he went incognito. Now, that's the first time in history a black man ever saved money by trusting a white man and sending it to sending him in his stead to do his business. I couldn't believe it. So I got it. So then they sent it up, and I had it digitized, and then I had it microfilmed over at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And then I read it. I had to do my physical therapy every day, so I would put a different chapter on my stationary bike, and I'd read a chapter a day, trying to feel the sensibility. Now, with the manuscript came, and what did I encounter when I saw the manuscript? It was a handwritten manuscript. The ink was faded brown, the pages were faded, and it had been bound, you know, through glue and a makeshift kind of binding. And at one time, there had been holes poked through all the pages, and it had been stitched together. It had been sewn together. And then later, maybe 30 years later, it had been glued together. And it was written on regular stationery paper. That's all I could tell. But when I read it, it read very much like fiction of the 1850s. Just, it had that feel to it. It had that sensibility about it. So I was convinced. Now, I was convinced of its authenticity as an historical document. I'll tell you about the authenticating the author in a minute. But, excuse me, with the manuscript came a letter, or two letters, one from a woman called Emily Driscoll, and this had not been advertised in the catalog, and one from Dorothy Porter Wesley. And it was an exchange of letters between the two, and Emily Driscoll, dated 1948, had said to Dorothy Porter Wesley that she had bought it from a traveling book scout who had come from New Jersey. Emily Driscoll was a famous antiquarian bookseller here in New York City. And you know what a book scout is? You know, they would just beat on the door and say, do you have any old manuscripts or anything in the attic or anything in the basement? Or they would go to rummage sales or antique shops, et cetera, et cetera. And she had sold it to Dorothy Porter for $85 in 1948. And Dorothy Porter had written her back and said that she was convinced that the author was a Negro, she said, because of the natural way that she introduced black characters into the novel. Now, I thought about this as I read the manuscript, and I went back to read Uncle Tom's Cabin. When Harriet Beecher Stowe, good-hearted as she was, introduced black characters into Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's with the equivalent of a drum and bugle. Here comes a Negro, here comes a Negro. Here comes black-skinned Uncle Tom, kinky-haired Mandy. There always is a physical description of their negroidness, as we would have said at that time. Never, here comes just an unmarked human being. And then later you find that that person's black. And I thought that was a really brilliant observation on Dorothy Porter Wesley's part. The other thing that she noted was that the evil white antagonist in the novel is a man named Mr. Wheeler. But in the first pages of the manuscript, it's written WH-R. But afterwards, someone had gone back to fill in the E-E-L-E, making the name Wheeler. And Mr. Wheeler owned a plantation in North Carolina and was a government official in Washington, D.C. And Dorothy Porter had left me a little clue saying there was a white government official in the 1850s and 1860s in Washington, and his name was John Hill Wheeler. So I had these two clues, but I had Dorothy Porter's belief that the author was black. And I really Dorothy Porter was a great scholar, but that wasn't enough to declare that the author was black. So how do you go about authenticating a manuscript? Well, as some of you know, I had authenticated another novel, or the ethnic identity of a novelist in the year 1982, and that was Harriet Wilson, who wrote a novel called Our Nig, which was published in Boston in 1859. People had known about the book, but they didn't know about the author, and I'd found her in the Boston City Directory and then the census, and then I found a lot of information about her in New Hampshire, where she lived, where she was born. So I used the methodology that I really developed on the go when I was authenticating that book in 1982. I made a list of all the proper names in the book. Now, despite the fact that this was a novel, I thought, since it obviously was a first draft, lots of crossing outs, there were paste overs for revisions in the manuscript, that maybe in the first draft, she would have used real names of people. And then, when she published it, had gone back to change the names. But it was a long shot. But even more frustrating was the fact that she didn't use a first and last name for most of the characters. She just said Mr. Wheeler, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Jones, et cetera, et cetera. How do you find somebody with just one name in the state of Virginia at some vague time in the 1850s? Well, she had mentioned, and she didn't write about many places. She mentioned Washington, D.C., but she mentioned a slave mart in Wilmington, North Carolina, but she mentioned that she was a slave near Milton, Virginia. So I turned on the computer, I went to Google, looked up Milton, Virginia, found this little MapQuest, and there it popped up Milton, Virginia. I cannot tell you what a miracle that was. Milton, Virginia then, and Milton, Virginia now, consists of 3 houses. It is not on any other map at which I looked, only on MapQuest. Why it is on there? Maybe the person who did it, the cartographer, was from Milton, Virginia. There is no good reason for it to have been on Milton, Virginia, but if I hadn't found that map, I wouldn't be standing here today. Because I found Milton, Virginia, which was on the James River, which is just as she said it was in the book. And I took a compass. Remember the little compasses we used to use when we were kids? I took a compass and I drew a circle around Milton, Virginia with a 50-kilometer radius. And then I started looking for the characters in the book who lived in Virginia. Now, in the Virginia section, there is one character who had two names, and his name was Frederick Hawkins. So I said, why not look for Mr. Hawkins? This is my only chance. So remember, I'm guessing at this point that the book was written between 1850 and 1860. Why 1860? No mention of the Civil War. No black person is going to write a book after 1860 not mention the Civil War. So that's just impossible. In 1850 for other reasons I'll talk about a little bit later. Well, I looked in the 1860 census. Now, how am I looking? Remember, I'm on crutches. I'm confined to the house. How am I looking in any archive? I called the place that knows more about the censuses and more about genealogy than any other place on earth, the Mormon Family Library. My good friends, the Mormons. The Mormons index the censuses. And they index the censuses, you know, for religious reasons, because they believe that you can, I don't want to not do proper justice to the religious doctrine of the Mormons, as I understand it, that they can baptize people who are dead and they can convert or something like that. If there's a Mormon audience, you could correct me in the question session. But they have a vested interest in knowing about genealogy all the way back to Adam and Eve, as it were. Well, I used their accelerated indexing system in 1982 when I was authenticating the ethnic identity of Harriet Wilson, the author of Our Nig. And I'd given them a lot of credit in my acknowledgments. So I called them. They had just published at the time the Freedman Bank records with a listing of every black person, or every person, 99% of whom were black, who had a bank account at the Freedman's Bank, which thrived basically, I think, between about 1866 and the early 1870s. Frederick Douglass, I think, was the last president of the Freedman's Bank. I think it was based here in New York, or else it was in Washington. I can't remember. Do you remember? Washington? It was in Washington, just like I thought. And so they had this index. So I called them and I said, look, this is who I am. I'm an invalid. Would you help me look through an invalid, quote unquote. Would you help me look through the censuses? And they asked me, everybody said no, and finally I got the director of the Mormon Family Library, and they asked me, they're very sympathetic, and they asked me how long I thought all this research would take. And I told them 1 week, maybe 2. And on that basis, they consented to give me a research assistant, a young man whom I still haven't met, a man named Tim Bingaman. And 6 months later, they reminded me of this conversation that we had. So I had Tim Bingaman, and I had Frederick Hawkins. So I decided to look in the 1860 census. So we looked in the 1860 census for Frederick Hawkins in the 4 or 5 counties adjacent to Milton, Virginia. No Frederick Hawkins. And it was a laborious methodology that we used. I would call him, he would go to the census, he would then Xerox whatever he found and mail it back to me, which would take 2 or 3 days. Now you have to imagine my study. I have this marvelous study, this big desk with an IBM computer on it. Imagine that on February 15, 2001, a completely empty desk before me. 6 months later, imagine that same desk covered with thousands of sheets of paper, all of which had been Xeroxed and sent to me by the Mormons. And so we looked in the 1850 census, no Frederick Hawkins. 1840 census, no Frederick Hawkins. 1830 census, no Frederick Hawkins. So I was about ready to give up. It must have meant that Frederick Hawkins was a fictional name, that my theory had been wrong, that she hadn't used real names. Now, I knew that it was a novel, so that would make sense, right? Well, I was ready to give up, and by this time I had read the entire novel looking for people with a first name and a last name, and there was only one more, and he was a child character, and I didn't think that was going to work. So I thought I would abandon the quest and try to maybe cleverly think of some other way to go about authentication, but I couldn't think of another way to go about authentication. So I picked up the phone and I called Tim Bingaman once again, and I said, Tim, it's a long shot, but look in the 1820 census. And he did, and he called me back and he said, Frederick Hawkins lived exactly where Hannah Crafts said Frederick Hawkins lived, according to the 1820 census. I had my first clue. I mean, I had it. And so then I went back, and I only had last names. There was a Reverend Roberts and a Mr. this and a Mr. that. I found everybody whom she said lived in Virginia within a 50-mile radius of this tiny hamlet of Milton. So that was really exciting. And that meant that I mean, there were people who were approximately the same age. One was a Presbyterian minister who had moved from New York. I found him in the 1850 and the 1860 census. He was a Presbyterian, and his place of birth was New York City. So that meant that she was using real names. This person actually existed. I looked in all the censuses for Hannah Crafts. Hannah Craft was a remarkably common name in 1850 and 1860, but all the Hannah Crafts were white. And I was convinced by this time that no white person could have written this novel. But I looked at all the Hannah Crafts, and none were living in either Washington, the combination of Washington and Virginia, which would allow them to be candidates for this job. Now, one night, I had a brainstorm, and I thought, well, maybe I'm looking too narrowly. Rather than look merely in 1850, 1860, 1840, how about at the end of the Civil War, beyond the Civil War? And how about in an adjacent state? So I called Tim Bingaman, and I said, why don't you look in, my man Tim, I said, why don't you look in the 1880 census? Why the 1880 census? Because there is a phonetic index to all the names. See, the Mormons have indexed them, but they're county by county, state by state. But you can look at the 1880 census, just type in a name of one of your ancestors, and it'll tell you where in the United States they are. Any census before that, you have to know the state in which they most probably lived. And it's a very laborious kind of research. So, and it's a great phonetic index. So no matter how the census taker spelled or misspelled Crafts, it would pop up in your search. So the 1880 census, he said, well, pick a state. I don't have time to look at all the states adjacent to, New Jersey. Why New Jersey? Because the novel ends in New Jersey. And remember, I said that the book scout had found the manuscript in New Jersey. So I thought New Jersey was a logical place to look. But no Hannah Crafts in New Jersey. So I picked Maryland just out of the blue. And he called me back, 1880 census. He found a Hannah Crafts living in Maryland, and what's more, she was black. The census taker had spelled her name with a K, but that's okay. That's good enough for me. And I was so happy. What's more, in the novel, Hannah Crafts ends up in New Jersey after escaping from North Carolina, and she goes to an all-black town, which she doesn't name, and she marries a Methodist minister. And guess what her name was? Her husband's name was in the 1880 census? Wesley. How clever, I thought. She had made a metaphor out of her husband's name, Wesley, as in John Wesley. It made him a Methodist minister. So I called my best friend Anthony Appia, and he came over, and we uncorked a great bottle of champagne, and we drank entirely too much champagne. And I woke up with a hangover. And I'd asked Tim, remember I said it took 3 days for him to mail all this information to me. And I said, Tim, this is so important. This is a great day in the history of my people. I want you to FedEx it, and I will pay for it. $20, $30, whatever it takes. So the next morning, I came downstairs, splitting headache, but I had found the first black author in the African-American tradition. This is great. This is a wonderful thing. And the man beat on the door, and he handed me this FedEx package, and I opened it, and it was one of those long Xerox of the census sheet, and I quite laboriously unfolded it, and I wanted to remember every second, because people would be asking me about this the rest of my life. Yeah, I didn't want to let history down. So I found her. There she was, Hannah Crafts with a K, just like the man had said. And then I looked over, and I thought, well, this is a problem. It said Hannah Crafts, born in 1850. Now, she could have been born in 1830. That would have been okay. And you know something, ladies and gentlemen? The more I looked at that 5, the more it looked like a 3 to me. Census takers in the 19th century, notorious for making mistakes. That brother was in a hurry, wrote that 5, look like a 3. But there was something else that I couldn't. If I could transform that 5 into a 3, there was one thing that the census page said that I couldn't transform. And that said that Hannah Crafts, with a K, born in 1850 or 1830, living with her husband Wesley in Maryland, was quite completely and totally illiterate. You know that hangover I had? My great moment was over. Well, I had by this time interested a publisher, a good friend of mine, Larry Kirschbaum, who runs Warner Books. And Larry Kirschbaum had said that Warner Books was interested in publishing this if we could authenticate the fact that it was written in the 1850s like I thought. And I said, well, I know it's written there. He said, well, how do you know? I said, because it feels like it was written there to me. And he said, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. Now, why was Larry Kirschbaum cautious? Larry Kirschbaum was cautious because he was the publisher of the Jack the Ripper diaries. Remember the Jack the Ripper diaries? Those authentic diaries that a pen and ink specialist called Joe Nickel looked at. He later told me, it took him 5 seconds. He looked at it and said, this is a total fraud. And so Larry Kirschbaum said, I will publish this if we get the pen and, the ink and the paper authenticated. So I said, how do we do that? And that's when I met Dr. Joe Nickel. We had the manuscript delivered to Dr. Joe Nickel. Dr. Joe Nickel is one of the editors of the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, based in Albany, New York. If you have a haunting, a poltergeist, you call him, he'll come down. He'll tell you if it's a real ghost or not. If you have a manuscript, he'll tell you tell you if it's real or not, tell you if it's historical or not, tell you if Hitler wrote it or not, the Hitler diaries. He exposed the Jack the Ripper diary fraud, the Hitler diary fraud. Okay, this is the man. I still haven't met this guy, but we talk on the phone quite a lot. So I had it flown up to him in Albany, New York, which is a suburb of, Albany is a suburb of Buffalo. And he spent 6 weeks with this manuscript. And he wrote his report. His report is like a piece of poetry, which is appended to the printed version of the book. And in it, he said the manuscript was written between 1853 and 1861, the start of the Civil War. It was written by an autodidact, a self-educated person. It was not written in the fine hand of a Victorian lady, a white upper-class Victorian lady, like, say, Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was written in a very awkward hand. The manuscript is full of mistakes. She uses no periods, no full stops, no ends of a sentence. Every sentence in this book in which you see a period, I put the period in, as I say in the introduction. She didn't know anything about periods. She was not a good speller, 150 words, consistently misspelled. She loved commas. Commas everywhere in this book. But I have a theory about her use of commas. We know that she wrote with a quill pen, and she used something called iron gall ink, which was very popular in the 1850s. It was very important that the ink be iron gall because there was another kind of ink that replaced it, and if she used that ink, then I was wrong, and the book would have been written a lot later. But my theory is that with her quill pen dipped into the ink well, she would write on her little stationery, and while the ink was still wet, she kept a bucket of commas right by her desk. And she would reach down and get a handful of commas and just sprinkle them. Like you put sprinkles on frozen yogurt or ice cream. That's what she did with commas. Commas were everywhere. But he said that there was no doubt that this was an authentic manuscript and that it rang true to him, and most probably it was a manuscript who had been written by a person who was a female fugitive slave. And he said it was clear that the person who wrote this manuscript had known Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler in the book, precisely because, as I said earlier, that she had gone back to fill in the gaps between W.H. and R in Wheeler's name. Now, by this time, I had begun to share the results of my research with several other scholars, including William Andrews, who at the time was the chair of the English department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the world's greatest authority on the slave narratives. And Bill Andrews called me one day, it was in the summer, and he asked me if I knew who this Mr. Wheeler was. Now, remember I had said that Dorothy Porter had left a letter, and the letter said that there was one man named John Hill Wheeler who was a minor government official in Washington in the 1850s and the 1860s. Well, by this time, I had looked through the censuses in North Carolina and Washington, and indeed, there was only one person in America who, by the name of Wheeler, who owned a plantation in North Carolina in 1850 and who was a government official in Washington, and that was John Hill Wheeler. So I knew about him, and in 1854 he became the minister to Nicaragua, the ambassador to Nicaragua for the American government. So Andrews called me and said, "Do you know who John Hill Wheeler is?" And I said, "Yeah, you know, that's Hannah Craft's master." He said, "No, dummy. John Hill Wheeler was the master who owned Jane Johnson." I've said, "Jane Johnson, in the case of Passmore Williamson?" He said, "Yes." Okay, what's the case of Passmore Williamson? John Hill Wheeler is leaving Washington, D.C., where he's a minor government official, to take up his post in Nicaragua as ambassador. To get from Washington to Nicaragua at that time, you would take, however, you know, ride a stagecoach or whatever from Washington to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, you would catch a boat, sail to New York, then catch another boat and sail to Nicaragua. Okay? Now, with him, traveling with him on his way to Nicaragua, was his wife's favorite slave, whose name was Jane Johnson. And she had two little boys, Isaiah and Daniel. And they were going through Philadelphia. Philadelphia, you know, is a hotbed, radical abolitionism. Benjamin Franklin, first president of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, 1789, 1790. And the home of many of the principles in the Underground Railroad, Philadelphia. And his father-in-law, the famous painter Thomas Sully, had said, "Do not bring that slave through Philadelphia." He said, "I am John Hill Wheeler. I am the ambassador of the American government to Nicaragua. I can do whatever I want." So he brought Jane and the two little boys with him. Now they stop at this big hotel in the middle of Philadelphia. It is July 1855. And Wheeler's hungry. Now obviously he didn't invite Jane to come into the dining room. So he had Jane and the boys sit in the lobby of this hotel. And he told her, while he went in the dining room, but before he did, he said, "If any of these colored waiters, all of whom were free, obviously, it was Pennsylvania, any of these colored waiters ask you if you are a slave or not, you tell them, first of all, tell them you're free. And then if they figure out that you're really a slave, tell them you like being a slave. And you don't want to be free." I swear to God, this is a true story. So he said, "You promise?" She said, "I promise." I love this woman. So Wheeler goes in and orders his three-course meal. And he's so worried that Jane is going to run away that he pretends to start his meal, and he gets up quietly and creeps in through the door and peeks around it to look at Jane to see if she's talking to any of those free-colored waiters. But Jane's sitting there knitting or playing with the boys or whatever Jane was doing. So satisfied, he goes back and starts the soup course to his meal. As soon as Jane Johnson is convinced that Wheeler is preoccupied eating, she runs over to the first black waiter she sees and says, help me, I'm a slave, I'm a slave. I want to be free." So the waiter immediately sends a note to the offices of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And sitting at his office, minding his own business, is the secretary of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He's a black man named William Still. Now, you can read about this in a book that he published in 1872 called The Underground Railroad. He tells you, this account is from William Still. He said he's sitting there minding his own business, answering letters. This black waiter comes flying in and says, there's a slave to John Hill Wheeler and two little boys, and they're about to go to New York, and then they're going to be shipped to Nicaragua, and we have to save them. So he jumps up and gets Passmore Williamson. And this is known as a famous court case called the case of Passmore Williamson. Passmore Williamson's a Quaker. He was white. He's the president of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He gets Passmore Williamson. The two of them converge on this hotel. By the time they get there, Wheeler, Jane, and the boys are gone. So they go, oh, shucks. And they run down to the dock, afraid that the boat has already left. But when they get to the dock, they see the boat still there. The gangplank's down. And there on the second deck is Wheeler with Jane and the two little boys. So they run across the plank, they run upstairs, and they say, you're on free Pennsylvania soil. Do you want to be free? Ma'am, you have as much right to be free as I do, said Passmore Williamson. And she said, yes, yes, I want to be free. Wheeler said, this is my property. There's a Fugitive Slave Act. You passed in 1850. You have no right to the property. They get into a fight. And they take Jane, they punch out Wheeler, and they take Jane away. And some other black men who were servants jumped in and started punching Wheeler too. And they take Jane away. And the next morning, Wheeler, interrupts his trip, of course. The next morning, he files suit, federal court, claiming that his property had been stolen. And Passmore Williamson stands trial. So does William Still and the other black men. They're all exonerated except for Passmore Williamson. Passmore Williamson goes to jail. He's in jail till November of 1855. There's a dramatic moment in the middle of the case when Lucretia Mott, the famous abolitionist, brings in a hooded person into the courtroom. And at the crucial moment in the trial, they rip off the veil covering her, and it's Jane Johnson. And she stands up and makes an eloquent plea for her freedom and saying that no, she hadn't been stolen, she wanted to be free, and that she planned to escape from New York anyway. She had a disguise with her. She was going to escape dressed as a man, which is exactly how Hannah Crafts escapes at the end of this book. And then because there's such pandemonium in the court because Jane Still is his property that they spirit Jane off into outside of the court as an awaiting horse and carriage, and Jane Johnson is heard from no more. Jane and her two little boys disappeared. No historian had ever found her before. Now, while I'm reading The Case of Passmore Williamson in The Underground Railroad by William Still, after William Andrews had called me to ask me if I knew that John Hill Wheeler was Jane Johnson's master, was the principal in the case of Passmore Williamson, I had cold chills. Why? I thought, oh no, this is too good to be true. And I went back to the manuscript, remember, which had just been digitized. I was reading it like typescript. And I read about Mrs. Wheeler's visit to her best friend's plantation in Virginia. Now, this is what happens. Mr. Wheeler living in Washington, remember, he's a government clerk. And so summer vacation, they go down to this plantation in Virginia. And Mrs. Wheeler's at her best friend's plantation. And she says that she wants to get her hair done. Her hair's all matted. And that she hadn't been able to have a good, hair combing. And she's sort of attracted to our heroine, Hannah Crafts, a mulatto servant. And she asked if she could do hair, and she said yes. So she says, and she's been looking for a female slave anyway. So this is really a test for Hannah, that if she could comb her hair well, she's going to purchase her. And so she's sitting in the chair, having her hair combed by our heroine, Hannah. And Hannah's trying to get all these tangles out of Mrs. Wheeler's hair. And Mrs. Wheeler says, now I'm reading the novel, right? Mrs. Wheeler says, ow, you're hurting my head. Ow, why, be careful. My hair is so tangled. Ow, my hair is so tangled. My hair is tangled because I haven't been able to have my hair done decently since Jane ran away. That was the smoking pistol that I needed. Because that meant that this Wheeler was the Wheeler who owned Jane. Jane is mentioned 10 times in 2 paragraphs in this book. And it also meant that the person who wrote this book knew the Wheelers, which was obvious from reading the book, and knew enough about the Wheelers to know that Jane Johnson ran away. And it was precisely because Jane ran away that our dear Hannah was hired. And so I had tears running down my face. And the rest of it was a piece of cake. There was a lot of internal evidence. As I said, Dorothy Porter had left me this letter, left someone this letter, posterity a letter. Dorothy died in 1995, saying that she was convinced that the author was a Negro, as she put it, because of the natural way that she introduced the black characters. I looked at every black character. Every black character in this book is introduced as a normal human being because blackness is the default if you're a black writer. And white people are exotic. So you describe the white people in an unusual way, not the black people. So that was good internal evidence. She had many counterintuitive claims. She said, for example, that white mistresses in the South shared the utmost intimacies with a a black female slave. And she portrays her mistress in a very humane way, her different mistresses, not Mrs. Wheeler. She hated Mrs. Wheeler, but other mistresses. If you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Harriet Beecher Stowe is not about portraying, writing from Cincinnati, is not interested in painting a complex picture of intimate relationships between black slaves and white people in the South. In fact, you get the picture of white people as demonic. I mean, slaveholders as demonic, because the whole point of Uncle Tom's Cabin is to turn you against the institution of slavery. This book is much more nuanced. In fact, it's so nuanced that this black author often says terribly degrading things about lower-class black people. Who are the lower-class black people on a plantation? The field hands. She was a mulatto house servant. And she talks about, at one point, about the vile, filthy inhabitants of the huts, meaning in the fields, and the workers in the field. And in fact, she refuses to run away until Mrs. Wheeler, to punish her, kicks her out of the big house, forces her to become a field hand, and attempts to force her to allow herself to be married, married to, forcibly raped by a black field hand. And she says over and over in this book, I don't believe that slaves should get married, meaning have children. Because if we don't have children, slavery would die. We perpetuate the system of slavery by colluding in its propagation. And then she says, when she's mulling over whether she should run away, she says, why should I allow myself to be violated by this man who has nothing in common with me, when, following my own principles, refusing to propagate slavery, to perpetuate slavery, I have turned down the overtures of men to whom I could be or have indeed been attracted. Why should I do that? She said, I'd rather die in the swamp trying to escape to the north than to commit this crime or to participate in this crime against nature and against God and against myself. And so, the next day, she runs away. And she runs away disguised as a white boy. And this is exactly the mode of escape used in 1848 by William and Ellen Craft in Savannah, Georgia. Ellen Craft was a mulatto. She dressed like a man with a top hat and a bandage around her mouth as if she just had some sort of surgery so that she wouldn't be forced to talk. Her husband was very dark-complected. He dressed like the slave that he was, as if he was the driver for this white man, and they just rode in their carriage to Philadelphia all the way to freedom. That is exactly, the guise of a man and a white person. That's the method that dear Hannah used to escape, and she ended up, as she said, in New Jersey, living in an all-black town, and no other slave narrative or novel ends in New Jersey. But when I did research, I found out that New Jersey was a terminal point on the Underground Railroad. There were about a dozen all-black towns because of that. And again, it's not something that a white woman, say in New York or Cincinnati or Philadelphia or Boston, would have known. And she says she lives happily ever after with a Methodist minister who's her husband. It's the only narrative that ends in New Jersey. Now, since that time, we have identified more and more of the characters in the book. Since we published the Bondwoman's narrative, we've identified more and more of the characters described in the book. And an independent genealogist named Catherine Flynn, who has a PhD in biochemistry from Yale, and who's an independent genealogist, found Jane Johnson. Jane Johnson escaped from Philadelphia in July of 1855 and ended up in Boston, living around Joy Street in Boston on Beacon Hill, which was a black neighborhood where a lot of the most famous abolitionists lived. And more than that, she found a letter that the well-known black abolitionist William C. Nell wrote to Passmore Williamson, saying, we have Jane, we have established her in a home in Boston, and Jane would like you to write to her. Now, why is that so important? Because Jane's affidavit for the case of Passmore Williamson was signed with an X. So as I say in my introduction, I excluded her as a possible author of this book because I just presumed that she was illiterate. But by the end of the year, William Nell is saying, write to her directly, here's her address, she wants to correspond with you. And the 1860 census, Catherine Flynn has discovered, lists her as literate. So it's possible that Jane Johnson wrote this book. It's possible that a woman named Hannah Vincent wrote this book. When I was looking so painstakingly for black Hannah Crafts in New Jersey, the wonderful person who typed the manuscript said, Professor Gates, you'll never find her under the name Hannah Crafts. Her name is Hannah Vincent. Why? Because Hannah initially is a servant, is a slave of the Vincent family in Virginia. The reason I'm called Gates is because Jane Gates was purchased by an Irishman who was my great-great-grandfather named Brady, who bought Jane from Horatio Gates' plantation in Berkeley Springs, now West Virginia, but then Virginia. That's how all black people, unless you have an Arabic name, you know, change your name for some other reason, that's how we all got our names. And indeed, when I looked in the 1850 and 1860 census in New Jersey, there was a Hannah Vincent, who's a mulatto and who is a member of the Methodist Church. And I found a history of the AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church in New Jersey, a history of the AME Church in New Jersey, published in 1887. There's Hannah Vincent, and she filled every position possible to fill in the AME Church between 1860 and 1890, and she was indeed a school teacher. So it could be her, or it could be somebody else. I don't know. But the one thing I know is that this person believed in freedom. She believed in the strength and power of the individual will. And for her, writing was not merely a way of only entertaining. It was an expression of her inner being. It was her mode of survival. For her, the will to power was the will to write. So here we have the first novel written by a black woman who defies the evil, oppressive practices of her terrible mistress, Mrs. Wheeler, and then to defend her sexual integrity, risk life and limb, runs through the swamps, following the North Star, ending up in New Jersey, and then sits down on her kitchen table using a quill pen, an iron gall ink, and a thimble from her sewing box. Joe Nickel has proven to affix the paste wafers, the equivalent of Post-its, to the pages of her manuscript every time she made a revision. And it was to honor the African American tradition and the tradition of African American women that I had the privilege and the pleasure of publishing the Bondwoman's narrative. Thank you very much.